There's this one memory, this one scene from my marriage that still really stands out to me. And it stands out partly because of what was said and partly because of the reaction in the room after it was said. Or more accurately, I guess, the lack of reaction. So let me paint the scene. My ex and I, were in a church couples small group. You know, those weekly meetups where everyone talked about communication and connection and loving each other the right way, right? We'd pray, we would do things, ask how we could support each other, all of these sorts of things. And, you know, we were basically committed to doing life together in a supportive way. And I remember sitting there on the couch, just kind of trying to feel like I belonged amidst this group of seemingly very happy couples, trying to feel like I was doing marriage the right way, trying to feel like I was, you know, patient enough, loving enough, Christ-like enough. And looking back, I really wanted to belong. And the thing is that sometimes harm doesn't always look dramatic or violent. It doesn't always come off that way. And that this pressure to belong can really result in a lot of silence. And I think that a lot of women out there are actively trying to do things right when this harm occurs. And of course, the context really matters because this space was meant to represent safety and wisdom. And what unfolded was simply not that. Welcome to Create Your Happy. I'm Christy Holt, your one and only happiness hussy. And this season, I'm going there. These relationship rants are for the woman ready to stop abandoning herself and start choosing truth. Let's get into it. Now, before we go any further into the conversation, I do want to offer a gentle heads up. This conversation will touch on themes of relationship harm. And while nothing will be explicit, the moment I'm about to share could be uncomfortable to hear. It is a moment that sits amongst one of many catalysts that eventually led me to leave my marriage. And it may also be a difficult, challenging conversation for some to listen to because it also brings religion into the conversation. Now, I intend to share it with care and with respect for how tender these topics can be, but I want to give you the opportunity to choose to continue listening as it fits you. So let me pick up the story because we're in this group of couples and someone asked a question. And honestly, I can't really remember exactly how it unfolded. I don't remember what the question was, but what I do remember is his response because he smiled like jovially and proudly announced, "I like to give her a rope to hang herself with." He chuckled, actually, and I froze. Now, he went on to clarify, still smiling, that what he meant by this was that he liked to tell me I could do something and then guilt trip me for it later. Like it was clever, like it was funny, like it was a personality quirk. But to me, the wildest part, surprisingly, wasn't even what he said. It was that no one else in the room even blinked. No one interrupted him. No one really questioned it. No one checked in with me. Not the pastor, who was one of the group leaders, not the other couples that were there, and not the women in the room that I had considered friends. It was just silence. And now sometimes this manipulation, when it's framed as humor, can hide the harm behind it. And while he was the only one who laughed, the silence from others still really communicated some underlying permission. And when this silence happens, it actually ends up reinforcing normalization of harmful manipulative tactics. Now, in this case, there was no concern for the person, who was being put in harm's way by this so-called joke. And that, to me, was a huge red flag because emotional abuse often appears socially acceptable and is normalized, and that is not okay. So I sat there frozen. Honestly, My face was burning. My mind was spinning. Like, did nobody else fucking hear what just had happened? They all carried on like it had never been said. And in that moment, something inside of me went very still. And I certainly didn't understand the weight of it at the time. I was far too deep in the overwhelm and too busy trying to be the good Christian wife and very practiced at doubting myself at this point. But I felt something inside click. It was probably a knowing that I couldn't explain yet, but somehow I couldn't just brush it off and forget about it. And to be fair, I wish I could say that this snapped me out of it and that I immediately decided I deserved better and I left, but I didn't. Now, I stayed for years after that, continuing to try to justify. I walked on eggshells. I, did everything I could to avoid conflict or to avoid creating more circumstances like that. But that moment stuck with me, as some really significant things in life tend to do. And I want to just mention here that my freeze response was not a weakness. It wasn't that I was too, not ballsy enough, I guess, to speak up to him. It was a nervous system response that signaled complete and utter lack of safety in that situation. And often the body will register the truth before the mind can articulate it and before we can actually, cognitively grasp or understand what is going on. And, when I look back, I can see this from a different lens, because remembering this moment and seeing how I responded in that state of freeze actually makes me, remember that I was protecting myself. And knowing that I had this mechanism for protection built in and this safety that I was essentially creating for myself very slowly built up my self-trust. And oftentimes we wonder why people stay in relationships in which they're very unhappy, why they stay in relationships where they don't feel safe, they don't feel heard, or perhaps they're even in more direct danger. And I want to say this very clearly for anyone out there. Staying didn't mean that I was weak, and it doesn't mean that anyone else who stays is weak. In my case, what it meant was that I had been conditioned, largely. Because when you're raised with the whole idea that you're born a sinner, that your instincts are flawed, that your heart is inherently deceptive, and that you are basically nothing without God or Jesus to save you, you essentially learn not to trust yourself. And when the concept of marriage is sort of idolized, then the relationship itself, like the institution of marriage, actually becomes more sacred than the people. And this applies even when the people inside of it are suffering. Leaving is not often framed in the church as discernment. It's framed as failure, as selfishness, as a lack of faith. The marriage was protected. The system was protected. The ideologies were fucking protected. But I was not. And, leaving, being moralized as a failure, as a personal failure, tripped me up at the end of both of my marriages. I'd like to say that after the first one, I felt okay with it, and that the second time it didn't sting as much, but that would not be true. The reality is that oftentimes endurance and longevity in relationship is praised far more than honesty and happiness and safety. And this is often because the systems are more protected and protected over the safety of individuals. And I think back to being in groups like this, and this was not just this one singular setting. This happened in many, many settings, not just in the church either, but a couple of things inside the church really do stand out to me. And there are also circumstances outside of it that really were catalysts for my leaving. But I want to say that sometimes we don't just share the vulnerable parts of ourselves for attention. Like, it's not just to get attention or for like the shock value of it, but sometimes we're sharing to test if this is a safe space to be. And that group was supposed to be safe. But when no one responded, when no one even paused, I learned something important. And like I said, it wasn't necessarily something important about my relationship. It was something important about the room. That silence was information. And my vulnerability safety check epically failed because the silence communicated the clear values. And to be fair, so lack of response is still a response. And I'm not placing blame or judgment, because it is also quite possible that the people in the room just did not know how to respond. And so I do give them grace. And I'm not holding this, as a traumatic experience for me. I'm sharing this because it stands out to me as a pivotal moment. And because what I notice in patterns today is that unsafe groups teach women to go quieter. It teaches them not to speak up. And what we need today is not women who have abandoned themselves and stopped speaking. We need women who are courageous enough to be vulnerable, of course, in the right safe spaces. So what came next wasn't help. It was judgment dressed as wisdom. And this came from, like I say, far more than just this couples group. It came from many directions. Comments like, oh, marriage is just hard and all couples struggle. And have you tried praying more? And I'll pray for your marriage. The thing is that forgiveness was expected far more often than repair was suggested. And as a result, I was taught to move on quickly, to release any resentment, to stop keeping a record of any wrongs or, keep track of any of those things. But the thing is that nobody was asking for accountability. No one was asking for things to change, except for me. No one was really supporting me, because prayer without protection is not supportive and it's not helpful. And minimizing the harmful behavior actually keeps harm intact. And this is why so much abuse goes on inside of homes. Not only that, this little sidetrack here, because prayer is often offered instead of any sort of intervention. And that's not helpful. And the fact that forgiveness is often demanded or suggested when there hasn't been any repair is incredibly harmful. Now, sidebar on forgiveness, because I think that there is, especially in the church, a lot of misconception about forgiveness. And I actually have a podcast episode all about forgiveness in season 3. So if you want to dive into that topic further, you can go back and check out that episode about forgiveness and self-compassion. Because forgiveness truly is for you. And so I totally understand where they're coming from to say that forgiveness is you releasing the suffering from yourself. And that part is completely valid. The part that was not valid was the idea that forgiveness means forgetting or letting go of the harm, making it, which makes it feel like you're making it to be okay. And that is not the point of the forgiveness. The forgiveness is simply for you to set down the harm so that you do not continue to harm yourself over and over and over again with the stories and the pain that you have already experienced. It is not about letting the other person off the hook in any way, shape, or form. And it's certainly not about fucking forgetting. So, forgiveness without repair is a really tricky subject. And I think that encouraging people to let it go is a nuanced discussion. But I'm going to leave that there. Now, the result is that accountability is therefore avoided by slapping some spiritual language on it. And this protection and safety ends up being replaced with the expectation of endurance. And that was not it for me. It did not feel right. It did not feel safe. And well, that's why I'm here talking about this today. Now, I also recognize here that I wasn't taught how to express anger because for women especially, angerness has been sort of framed as bitterness or cynicism or an unladylike. It is viewed as rebellious, and it's certainly viewed as unchristian-like behavior, which is ironic because Jesus literally flipped tables when he saw things that were simply unacceptable. But I digress. So instead of the anger I felt in the situation becoming useful information, it simply became something that I swallowed. And there is a lot of things to be angry about and confused about from my perspective when it comes to organized religion. Things like purity culture. So adding in this factor where women are taught that their bodies are dangerous to men, their desire is suspect, and sex is something that they must obediently give rather than experience, right? We're supposed to be pure, virginal, perfect until we get married, and then we're supposed to become a freak in the sheets. And then add on top of that the submissive wife narrative where silence is praised and compliance is rewarded and sacrifice gets mistaken on the regular for love. And, we say things have changed over the last number of decades, and they have. But some of these echoes still remain. They are just a little bit quieter now. Really allowing yourself to feel the anger. And this is what sort of helped me. And I'm not like a ragey person, and I'm not talking about raging, although, like I said, even Jesus flipped some tables. This is about not erasing yourself. It is about not stuffing your emotions because then they come out sideways. It is about being true to yourself and honoring yourself despite this conditioning, this cultural and religious conditioning that really still does persist today. And I think that one of the most damaging messages that I might have heard from within the church specifically, and one that many women do internalize, is that if you're feeling disconnected, that you should put out more because sex is how your husband receives love. And this, unfortunately, puts sex into an obligatory category. It becomes a tool to regulate his emotions, a tool to regulate the relationship, a tool to express love. And it becomes then a duty instead of desire. And that isn't real intimacy, and it certainly isn't consent. And this suggestion to simply put out more in order to stabilize unsafe dynamics is really harmful. The emotional disconnection that often leads to a lack of sexual connection is framed as a wife's problem, a wife's inadequacy, instead of focusing on where the real disconnect is. And often that is on the emotional side. And I'm not going to point fingers. This could equally be the man or the woman refusing to or having, challenges, difficulties, not having the tools or skills or understanding to connect emotionally. But when we place the focus on the sex instead, this actually erodes desire. It erodes safety, and consent cannot properly exist without emotional safety. A woman absolutely, and a man too, absolutely needs to be able to say no at any time without consequences or for her consent to be valid. Again, I've digressed again. Another thing that I want to talk about is that often God becomes an excuse for avoiding accountability. And let me explain what I mean here, because what I'm trying to say is that having faith does not replace responsibility. Using God or God's word is not a get out of accountability card. Using the concept of Satan is not a scapegoat or an excuse for harmful behavior. And love without repair, like I said earlier, isn't love. It's actually just control dressed up in spiritual language. And sometimes this spiritual language can actually end up bypassing accountability. For example, when people are harmed directly and someone says, well, I see it this way because it's God's word to see it this way. And there is a distinction between holding a belief and outward harmful behaviors. And it's a slippery slope because faith is often used to excuse harm. And this is actually just continuing to perpetuate harmful patterns and behaviors. And the thing is, as well, inside of relationships, responsibility is essential to love. Repair is not a negotiable. It's something that is absolutely necessary if you want to maintain connection and relationship with someone. So all that to say, I just kind of want to wrap this up by saying that if you're looking for a place where you won't be told to stop complaining or to serve him better, to put out more, to, reframe your experience more positively, gaslight yourself into thinking it's okay, or, to clean up your language, or to stop feeling some type of way, or simply to reinterpret the experience that you've had that was harmful so that someone else out there doesn't have to feel uncomfortable hearing about it, I'm here. And what I'm here to do is help you stay connected to yourself. I won't minimize what you're living because that's not helpful. And I sure as hell won't be asking you to reinterpret harm to protect someone else's worldview. So I want to leave you with this one last loving reminder, especially if you heard any part of yourself in this conversation. And that is that you deserve a love that doesn't require you to abandon yourself. Thanks for listening. If this rant landed, hit follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And check out my additional resources at coachchristyholt.com. If you're craving clarity in your own relationship, reach out. I'd love to connect. I love you. Now let's go do some epic shit, shall we?